If you listened to last week's podcast or radio program, you heard me announce the beginning of a new program that was supposed to start this past week. Well, some of you may have noticed it did not start as originally planned, so let me explain why. Due to a change in some family circumstances, we moved the date for the startup of the new radio program to the 31st of August. That's August 31st for the program Truth to Ponder. But today, I've got a special guest and a special program for your weekend show.
It's your weekend show with Bob Bierman.
In just a couple of minutes, you're going to be hearing an interview that I had with George Christensen. He's a federal member of the Parliament in Australia. Now, actually, I was a guest on his podcast, but he's allowed me to get an audio recording of his video podcast and share it with you on today's weekend program. But before we get to this time with George Christensen, I want to tell you about the new radio show that starts on the 31st. Yes, it really will start on the 31st of August. It is called Truth to Ponder. It'll be available as a podcast, as many of you listen to this program as a podcast. And I'm really glad that the program got a delayed start. The idea of doing such a program has been in my mind for about several weeks, actually several months. And I was afraid to launch the program, not so much because of the expense, but the amount of time it would take for me to do. After all, I'm not a large corporation. I don't have a big staff. So I have to do the research, the recording, the editing, and getting it out to the stations. And I thought that would be a lot of work. But my heart kept saying, you got to do this program. And what's becoming increasingly obvious to me, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, a number of people have come across my path that I think are going to be a major part of this radio program that'll start and podcast on the 31st. We will look at politics, we'll look at current events, but we're going to look at them from the premise of what does it all mean in this age and what kind of an age are we living in. And I think you'll find the program helpful and informative. I remember working for an individual that had a radio program, a ministry, so to speak, that dealt with those issues, but over time, a lot of things happened there that just did not seem correct. And now they're not even on radio anymore. They're strictly on the internet. And some of what they're teaching and saying never came true. And a lot of what they're doing now doesn't make any sense. In a way, I want to bring that kind of radio back where I can deal with real important issues. And we can look at them together. So in just a moment, after this first little break, we'll be back with George Christensen here on Your Weekend Show.
On the air and online at yourweekendshow.com with Bob Bierman. Your Weekend Show with Bob Bierman.
And welcome back to Your Weekend Show. I am your host, Bob Bierman. So glad you're with me this weekend. Well, this past week, I had the privilege of being a guest on somebody else's podcast, and it was from a podcast called Conservative One, Defending Traditions and Freedom. It is hosted by George Christensen, who's an Australian member of Parliament, and somehow he discovered my radio show and podcast. We started talking, and he invited me to be his guest, and I'll give you details when you can actually see and view that podcast. And so without any further ado, I'm going to let you hear the audio track of our video podcast here on Your Weekend Show.
G'day, I'm George Christensen, host of Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedom. I'm joined by another podcast host that I just came across only recently. I've known of him for quite a while. He's from the United States of America. He hosts a show called The Weekend Show. Another podcast he's launching soon and already has a few podcast episodes up is called Truth to Ponder. The person I'm talking about is Bob Bierman. He has been around in radio since the 1970s, but interestingly, he is a bishop of the Reformed Anglican Church, which is a traditional Anglican church as opposed to the quite liberal Episcopal Church in America. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Bierman. How are you? Bishop Bob or Bob?
Just call me Bob for the program. I'm so used to doing that because of my years in radio. And apologize for the just out of bed look that we have because of our 14-hour time difference. I just got up a little while ago, and I'm excited to be here on your podcast today.
Well, thank you very much. And I got to tell you, I was keen to get you on after I heard just one of your podcast episodes, the latest one. Mm-hmm. You cut through. You cut through a lot of the stuff that's going on out there, and I've wanted to grab a voice from the USA just to explain to us what the hell is going on.
Yeah, well, let me give you some background. This may help just a little bit.
Yeah,
I've been in broadcasting, as you mentioned, since the early 1970s. I'm actually semi-retired now, but along the way, besides being on radio, I got involved with emergency management a little over a decade ago. And in that regard, I learned a lot about planning, preparation for disasters, man-made disasters, any kind of problem you run into. And I got called out of retirement early this year to help a county in North Carolina that is dealing with this pandemic that's going around the nation. So I got to really see some of the data a lot of people don't normally get a chance to see. And then I watch how our media tries to disseminate this information. And it's always about the panic. It's always about the fear. It's always about we're all going to die. When I was brought on board to go to a county in North Carolina, I'm not going to say which one, but I went up to North Carolina to a county of about 300,000 people, and they were telling us to expect by the middle of May 3,000 people to be dead. And so we needed to accommodate, and I spent March and April planning for 3,000 people to die. How many people do you think died in that county as of yesterday?
I'd hate to guess. It would be a very small number.
42. And out of that 42, we suspect that 20 had nothing to do with COVID.
Wow.
So that kind of changes things. Now, we were also told, people will say, well, wait a minute, you did the mask wearing, you did the social distancing. We were told with using social distancing, we'd drop that 3,000 figure to 1,500. But it's still 42. That's what we're really seeing. One thing in the United States today, now back in March and April, if you were to watch CNN or MSNBC, two of the most, shall we say, biased networks in the United States, they were giving you the death toll number every day. They don't do it anymore. They give you this grand total occasionally because it sounds good, but they don't tell you how fast it's rising because it isn't. It really isn't. Yeah. And they don't tell you that many of the deaths that they discuss are assumed. There was never a test taken. They just assume because they had either a fever or because they had a pneumonia-type symptom, it has to be COVID-19 without a test. And that's what's happening in the United States. Another thing that the media loves to talk about are overwhelmed hospitals. There's a news story over in South Carolina that this hospital is running at 94% capacity, and we're in trouble. Turns out the hospital had shut off 2/3 of their wings and beds and laid off 2/3 of their staff. They were 94% of 1/3 of what their capacity really is. And those numbers can be very misleading. People think, oh, and by the way, the 94% of the rooms being used, 3% were being used by COVID patients. That's it. Now, had this been a normal run of time, they would have been less than 1% of the hospital's usage. And so these numbers are being thrown around that are just not correct. And I really believe there's something, I hate to use the word nefarious, but I do know that Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago and former staff for the Clinton administration, once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happening in the world today. We never let a good crisis go to waste.
Well, yeah, I'm not one of the people who believe there's a pandemic, but I agree with you on that front that there are a lot of people taking advantage of this situation politically, and that is just plain obvious. That is plain obvious.
Let me give you another good example real quick. I just read this in the news this morning. This goes back a few days ago. In Wisconsin, if you are at home and you are a employee of one of the departments in the state of Wisconsin, and you're on like a Zoom call like you and I are on right now, something of this nature, even if you're home by yourself, you have to wear a mask to go on to a Zoom conference.
That is insane.
I know. This is where it's coming to. It's all virtue signaling. It's all we have to... And now we're finding out, the neck gaiters, you know what that is, the one you pull up over your face from your neck.
Yeah, right.
They tend to spread the virus even more than not wearing a mask at all. They've determined that in a study, that you get 110% because it concentrates, and the stuff that you're breathing all the time is accumulating and being breathed out at times through that gaiter, making it even worse. It doesn't do any good. It's like trying to stop a river with a chain link fence. Doesn't work.
I've never heard politics creeping into any medical situation ever, but this is something altogether different. Mm-hmm. What you've just said, I mean, the bizarre thing, you can jump on the internet, you can go and Google just masks, the efficacy of masks against COVID-19 or the Wuhan coronavirus,
right,
as I like to call it. And you'll find a plethora of articles saying, yes, that masks do work, and then a plethora of articles saying they don't, all with supposed experts being behind it. Now, this is bizarre. I mean, the one thing that I do notice is that most leftist governments seem to be pushing wear the masks.
Absolutely.
It's really a bizarre thing that, but I've never seen this sort of politicization of medicine where you've got experts on both sides telling us two completely different things. And we could go to the hydroxychloroquine debate as well.
Absolutely.
There certainly is a great degree, I got to say, a lot of it in the non-Western world, a great degree of evidence out there about the efficacy of certain treatments involving hydroxychloroquine and zinc. But go into the Western world and it seems that Trump derangement syndrome has taken
Absolutely.
over. And because Donald Trump said something good about hydroxychloroquine, it couldn't possibly be right for you.
Well, I shared on my program this past weekend about hydroxychloroquine and what we know about it, and it's not something that President Trump made up out of nowhere. A lot of people forget we have the same not exactly the same, but a close relative called SARS-1, SARS-CoV-1, back in 2003, 2004. And it came from China. Sound familiar? It's another one of those nasty viruses from China. It got into 30 countries, but the difference back then, the Chinese were more open about what happened, and so we were able to avoid the spread better than letting it fester for months, getting out. People forget that in China, this was going on in October and November of last year. And the World Health Organization, the big WHO, kept saying there's nothing to worry about. It's not contagious. And so November, December, January, it is getting out all over the world. China shut down travel within China to Beijing, but they did not shut down travel from Wuhan to the rest of the world. And so it escaped. This is what people fail to understand. So we just have a greater spread early on, and that's why it's taking so long to contain and basically burn its way through wherever the hosts are. Now, we learned in 2003 and 2004, and there's an excellent article put out by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, also, I think, one of the Canadian version of the same thing, London Institute of Health. All of these groups that are world-renowned, including the WHO, they discovered that hydroxychloroquine worked, and that is, you can go online and look for SARS-CoV and put in the date 2005, and that report comes up from a website. It's amazing. It's there. Anybody can see it. You can download it. I have. And this report came out 15 years ago talking about how effective it is as a prophylactic to prevent the spread. And what are we dealing with now? Oh, by the way, one of the agencies that signed off on that particular report includes the one run by none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci. Now, PolitiFact will tell you that what I'm saying is not true, but just go to the CDC's own website, pull down the document, you'll find out what agency signed off. It has been made very political, and we're being lied to as well.
All very bizarre. I read this article this week which talked about the new normal, and I've got to tell you, if I hear that term said by the mainstream media again, I'm going to do my TV set a great deal of damage. But this article talks about new normalism.
Exactly.
I love the word of this new normalism because it is an ism. It says new normalism is a classic totalitarian movement, albeit with a pathological twist. Mm-hmm. And the goal of every totalitarian movement to radically, utterly transform society, to remake the world in its monstrous image. In the new normal society they want to establish, fear and conformity will be pervasive. Their ideology is a pathologized ideology as opposed to, say, the racialized ideology of the Nazis. So it's symbologically pathological. Fear of disease, infection and death, and obsessive attention to matters of health will dominate every aspect of life. Paranoid propaganda and ideological conditioning will be ubiquitous and constant. Now, the article was written somewhat satirically, but with a little hint of reality there.
I know. There's a television program in the United States that was popular. I guess it still is. I don't watch it that much. I haven't seen it in ages, but it is called The Simpsons. You've heard of that program along the way. Somebody shared a little video clip from 10 years ago as all the media people gathered to plan a pandemic with a virus that'll be deadly and to put people in fear. And I looked at it, I'm going, it's COVID-19 all over again, but from 10 years ago on The Simpsons, and how they're going to get everybody afraid of everything and to do certain things. And I was amazed that sometimes you wonder, does comedy or does any of this parallel the real world we're living in? It's, satire is always based in reality. And it makes me wonder.
So I'm not sure where this is all leading to, because just like in the US, we've got areas here in Australia that are locked down, and actually the reality is that more people died of influenza and pneumonia in the first 3 months of this year than they have died in the last 8 months or 7.5 months of the year from COVID-19.
Well, here in the United States, we stopped counting flu deaths officially on the 4th of April. Even if you died of the flu on the 5th, it became COVID-19.
Wow.
That was a CDC mandate. If you understand how death certificates were coded after the April 4th ruling, I mean, we actually had people, this is no joke, and they finally took some of these people off. In Washington State, 5 people listed as COVID-19 deaths died of gunshot wounds. They had tested positive in prior weeks. In Orlando, Florida, a person died in a motorcycle accident. COVID-19. This is happening over and over again. If you had tested positive somewhere along the way and you die within such a period of time, you're automatically a COVID death.
That's crazy. That stuff, thankfully, is not going on in Australia as far as we know. But, you know, it all just adds to the point you made earlier that people, you know, never let a crisis go to waste.
Absolutely.
And I think that there is a big movement at the moment to just simply get Trump out in the United States and
in China.
Well, definitely in China. And a lot of the pandemic is, and the reaction to it has been geared towards trying to bring it down politically. Can I move away from the pandemic?
Absolutely.
Thing that has gone on in the US recently, which is the Black Lives Matters movement. Now, as terrible as the death of that fellow was, George Floyd, the reaction to it, I guess, completely bewildering in Australia initially, to see all these people rioting in the streets and burning buildings and looting stores and all the rest of it. And then, crazily enough, we had protests break out on our own streets here in Australia, where thankfully there wasn't the looting, all of that, but there certainly was violence.
Well, the truth is that Black Lives Matter has nothing to do with George Floyd and what happened to him. Zero.
Yeah.
It is an organization that has been around for several years. It is well-financed, well-planned, and it has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. It's kind of one of those things. How do you say that when you come against them, well, you don't like black people, you must be a racist, is the reply. But none of these people that are doing these riots, primarily they're white people in many cases, and they have no idea of why they're burning down buildings. I bet many of them today would probably even forget what they're rioting about in places, like Washington, D.C. Chicago is now going through another wave of people just breaking into stores. And the idea is, well, they're insured, so it doesn't matter. We can take their stuff. And I don't know how any of this correlates to what happened to George Floyd at all. But the movement has been around for years, and it is, like I say, well-funded. And their demands have nothing to do with racial relations. Nothing.
Look, the criminal behaviour that I saw, there was a now very famous show that Tucker Carlson actually had on his show, where he showed a bunch of activity, criminal activity going on, and how any of that related to the death of George Floyd is beyond me. But again, it seems to be that this whole movement has now been directed to get Trump out.
Absolutely.
He started being blamed for the cause of the protests, being blamed for his reaction to the protests, being blamed for not dealing with the civil unrest, a great deal of Trump derangement syndrome going on in the back of the Lives Matters movement.
Well, people forget that in the United States, we have 50 governors for these states that are supposed to be taking care of those kind of matters within their state. It's not the president's responsibility to do a governor's job. We've seen that in the states where all these riots are going on. Oregon is a good example. The city of Portland, that's Governor Brown, and that is the local mayor in those cities, or in Portland, or any of that whole region. In Seattle, same thing. Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot. These are why people elect them to be leaders in their communities or their regions. And they have the police departments, which they are now trying to defund to take care of these things, and it's not happening. Instead of trying to fix the problem, they're trying to make the problem worse. We're seeing in New York City, for example, a 400% increase in those officers retiring and leaving the city. And this is going to happen everywhere where they're being defunded. One of the funniest videos I saw, a real video, was somebody protecting their store in front of a group of Black Lives Matter protesters with their big signs, "Defund the police." The guy comes out of his store holding a chainsaw, saying, "Get away," because they were ready to break his windows. And someone goes, "Somebody needs to call 911 and get the police here." And they're holding signs saying, "Defund the police."
Idiots. Complete and utter idiots. And how that helps matters, I mean, is beyond me. I can't imagine shutting down police departments and stripping police of resources is going to cure racism, or even potentially cure what may be perceived as systemic overreach within police departments. It's not going to cure it. So if indeed there is anything systemic to cure, but look. Looking at this from afar, I wonder, I mean, this stuff is not, history now. It's happening. Only a couple of days ago, I understand there was about 5 hours of rioting and violence in Chicago. This stuff is still going on live right now.
And those downtown regions are becoming ghost towns because of all the COVID-19 lockdowns. I mean, right now, I think there's 100,000 businesses that are going to be never coming back. They're not coming back. Wow. And it's sad.
Are we seeing, in your view, permanent civil unrest, as it's been written in one article I read recently? Are we seeing the breakdown of American civil society?
In some places, yes. But, my wife and I, we're very blessed to have two places, two residences. We have a small place up in the mountains of northeast Georgia, where we are right now, and a house in Florida. And when we're up here in Georgia, we don't hear much about anything, not even the COVID crisis. It's kind of like, well, it's there, but it's not here. But I don't worry about the Black Lives Matter people coming up here, because people like myself and all my neighbors, we all have our concealed weapons permits, and we know how to take care of ourselves. And so in the rural parts of the United States, you're not going to see this happening at all. You just don't. My neighbor up here is a retired sheriff's deputy. We've got other retired law enforcement up here, and you got myself, and all of us are armed. And so I don't think they're coming to our particular neighborhood in the mountains. I just don't see it.
There really is two Americas. And I remember having this conversation with someone a while ago, just saying that these Black Lives Matter protesters, or rioters is what they should be called, are going to have to watch it, because they try and take their roadshow into one of the, the country towns.
It won't work.
Old boys, it's going to be a very, very deadly situation.
It would be. Well, look, they promised they were going to, the Sturgis motorcycle rally that occurs every year is happening right now, or just did, and they were claiming they were going to go there and mess with those folk. I don't think so. They never did show up. When you have thousands and thousands of motorcycle people with their Trump flags and everything else. And, of course, CNN will now say that they're going to spread COVID-19 back around the country and kill us all. But when they riot and protest, it doesn't. Magically, the coronavirus does not infect anybody in a protest with somebody screaming in your face. But it does affect you and kill you when you sing in a church. Notice.
Insane. Well, yeah, and we've got churches that are... have to be shut because you can catch coronavirus there, but abortion clinics can be open, so that must be
same thing here.
You don't get coronavirus. But I just on the issue of the two Americas and the good old boys from the counties, I saw a Facebook post where, and I can't remember the name of the town, but it was just the quintessential small country American town where word had gotten out that there were going to be protesters that were bussing in to do a protest in that town, and so a group of I think that they were militiamen actually turned up and asked the local Chamber of Commerce if they minded if they defended the main street. Mm-hmm. And they said, sure, please knock yourself out. So the protesters turned up in a very small van it was, by the way, and there's photos of this online. These guys were armed to the teeth who were protecting the main street. And I think the protesters sort of looked at them, looked back at the van, held their signs up for a moment, then got back in the van and drove off.
Pretty much what would happen where I'm at up here in the mountains. They're just not going to. It's a beautiful area. We love it up here. We spend quite a bit of time up here. And I spent years in this part of the world working, love it. And so my wife and I, we enjoy our time up here, but it's also a nice little, what I call a retreat. Now, where we live in Florida is not really a bad area. We do have a place on the East Coast, but we are north of what I call the insane regions of Palm Beach, Miami, and Broward County, the nutty areas of Florida. But what a lot of people do not realize about Florida is it's not all Miami. It's not all Orlando. There's quite a bit of it it's very rural and a lot of farmers. So one place like Okeechobee County, Sebring, Florida, you're not going to find Black Lives Matter having any kind of a impact or even showing up. It's just the nature, Florida or the Panhandle, forget it in the Panhandle, it's not happening. Too many military bases, too many retired military in that part of Florida. If you go, once you get past Tallahassee, a little, blue pimple, or Miami-Dade, part of Tampa, the rest of the state is extremely conservative. People don't realize that. We're 23 million in this state alone, in Florida. 23 million. Right now, we need to take a break here on Your Weekend Show. What you're hearing is me as a guest on a program called Conservative One, Defending Traditions and Freedom, hosted by George Christensen, a member of the Australian Parliament. And we'll be right back with the second half of that interview right after this.
On the air and online at yourweekendshow.com with Bob Bierman. It's Your Weekend Show with Bob Bierman.
Now, let's return to this interview with George Christensen. I was his guest on his podcast, Conservative One.
So let's go back to the magical protests where you can't catch coronavirus. Mm-hmm. I understand that might be next month, that on September the 17th, I'm not sure whether you've heard this, but there's going to be a siege of the White House. You have some leftist group out there promoting this hashtag White House siege.
Oh, that ought to be fun.
To occupy the front of the White House, to block the White House essentially, starting from September 17. And they're going to continue that right up until November the 3rd for 50 days, so they say. A sweet, revolutionary non-violence, they're calling it. So we've seen a lot of that non-violence going on in the US. I've got to say the Secret Service might not like the kind of non-violence that we've seen lately being done in the front of the White House. But how do you think that's going to play out?
Well, not well for the protesters, because what people don't understand, the security around the White House is a lot more than you'll ever see. It's just the nature of the beast. Nobody's going to be breaking into that area and get away with it. There is more security in that building than you can imagine, and more armament underground beneath it than you could ever imagine that'll come out to stop anybody in their protest. This is not 1860 when you could drive up to the front door. It's very different. Very different.
I was just saying, I think a fellow found that out the hard way the other day. Now, talking about the White House, you've obviously got the US election in full swing. It's going to be a very different election. I mean, all of the forces, mainstream media, are all out to get Trump, to get him out of the White House. You've got, according to the news that we're seeing back here in Australia, Joe Biden ahead in the polls.
Oh, baloney. Yeah, and Hillary was ahead in the polls by 10 points at this same point 4 years ago. Understand what let me explain something. If you're in Australia looking at what happens in the United States coming from our media, you're being lied to. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're intellectually, morally, and journalistically bankrupt. They're in for one side.
We get a double fake filter because it goes through your media and then it comes through our media. So I'm going to tell you that's a double fake filter that we're getting. Well, but that is all the news here, is that even bizarrely through some of our more conservative newspapers that are sort of trying to put the message up that Trump doesn't have a chance.
Well, that's what they said. They said that 4 years ago. Let me give you an example how people are here in the United States. 4 years ago, we were down at our house in Florida, and we were living in what they would call a swing county, a pretty good-sized county in Florida that could tip the election in Florida one way or the other. And one night, guess what? I was actually polled. I never thought I'd ever have that happen in my 65 years, but it did, because I lived in one of those critical places, and they wanted to know who I was voting for. And I looked at my wife and I said, "You're not going to believe this. I'm being polled." She said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "Watch." So who am I going to vote for? I'm voting for Hillary Clinton. I was not about to let them know who I was actually voting for. And guess what? Florida went for Trump. And I voted for Trump. So did my wife. So did my neighbors. So did half the people that I know down there voted for Trump. But they're not going to tell you. Also, they tend to oversample Democrats. They just do. They need to be sampling likely voters. But because of the ramifications, if somebody has a Biden bumper sticker on their car, no one's going to damage their car. I'm not going to damage your car. No one's going to mess with it. But if I have a Trump bumper sticker on my car, it'll be scratched. The people will damage it. There is an intolerance on the left for free speech. Only they can have free speech. You can't. Only their candidate can be talked about. Yours can't. So most people in the United States, we just don't tell you, or we'll give you a fake, and we'll say, "Yeah, I'm voting for Hillary," and that happens. They discover that after the fact in the exit polls, how many people would tell people they're voting for Hillary, but they were not. And that happened in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Florida, and that's why he won those states. And he's going to do it again. And I think, honestly, he's going to win with a wider margin this go-round than he did the first time.
Wow.
When you talk to people, I know actual individuals that voted for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago in a state like Florida that are not going to vote for a Democrat any longer. They're done. They're done with being lied to. They just had it, and so they're voting for Trump. People that have never voted before are voting for Trump. They've had enough.
Well, we certainly hope so. I certainly hope so, and a lot of my listeners certainly hope so, because we get a big problem around this part of the world with a country that likes to call itself the People's Republic of China. And
absolutely.
We can't see sleepy Joe Biden, being able to handle that beast. And,
well, his son got how many billions of dollars to manage from the Chinese? There's a conflict of interest with with the Biden family and the Chinese.
And a bigger problem is the fact how little we've heard of that story. There's been virtually no reporting of that in Australia. Has there been any significant reporting of it in the mainstream media in the US?
Not really. There's some outlets that have it, but most of CNN and NBC and ABC, our ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, and CBS, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, they all ignore it. They don't want to know about it. They want to bury it. But, the Bidens in China, there's billions of dollars that move through Joe Biden's son's hands. And also back when they were trying to do the silly impeachment, they're talking about Ukraine. Well, they keep forgetting how many millions of dollars Joe Biden's son was making from the Ukrainian gas company that was over there. He knows nothing about the industry, but he's being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a month to be on their board of Burisma.
The most bizarre thing about that whole Ukraine situation is that there was there was a reason. There was a real situation in the midst of all of that, and you haven't heard any of it. And the real situation involved Joe Biden's family and those payments.
It'll come out this year. It'll come out in the campaign, no doubt about it. I don't worry about it. Of course, I'm a person of faith, so I'm not. To me, politics is not the be-all, end-all. I'm more concerned about the work of the church. I'm more concerned about the bankruptcy we find within many of our denominations that have become liberal think tanks that don't even acknowledge the gospel any longer. That's why, as you mentioned before, the Episcopal Church in the United States, they've long since walked away. Methodist Church in the United States, Presbyterians, not all, but too many of the church bodies, even certain parts of the Lutheran Church, have gone completely bonkers. They've literally thrown their Bibles away and adopted a social gospel. And they cherry pick what they want from Scripture to back up what they're saying. It's all about love, love, love. There's never the judgment. There's never sin. There's never the atonement on the cross. There's none of it. We don't need it. We just need to be loving each other. And there's such a deception. And I look at the church today, and the post-coronavirus church is going to be very different. Many churches are going to close their doors forever because they couldn't make it through the pandemic. Their people were not that committed. They value this life more than they value the life that Jesus wants to offer them. And I really believe many churches will never reopen their doors. I also believe there's going to be a significant part of our population over the age of 60 that's going to be scarred for a number of years because of this virus and living in fear of being in crowds that are going to have to be dealt with. And I really believe that we're coming into a time. I would never go out on a limb like a lot of these preachers do and try to predict the end of the world. And is this going to happen? Is that going to happen? Is this the Great Tribulation? Are the angels with the bowls of wrath standing over our heads as we speak? I'm not going to go that far. But I will say one thing, that over the centuries, there have been times of turbulence and tribulation. It has happened in many parts of the world. As I tell somebody who looks at our situation in the United States, I remind them, if you lived in Poland in 1939, you would have thought this is the Great Tribulation as the Nazis came across the border and just ravaged your country in a matter of hours. And you would have thought living under their rule, people being thrown into concentration camps, you would have thought this is the end times. This is it. We've had many such experiences over these 2,000 years since Christ rose and walked away from that tomb. There's been plenty of examples, and I think it's America's time and the Western world's time to go through a time of tribulation, because since the Second World War, what has happened? Let's look at Great Britain. During the Second World War, people flocked to their churches. They prayed. They were concerned. And now you come 60 some odd years later, 50 years later after that, people were walking away from the church in droves. And they don't believe anymore. Their parents that went through the war made it too easy for baby boomers like me, where we didn't have to. Well, my family, we did. But for the most part, the exodus from the church started in the 1960s, accelerated in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now today, the majority of people in the United States and the Western world are agnostic. They don't really believe in God, or they believe in a God, but they don't believe in what they call organized religion. They don't hold the Bible in any esteem at all. It's just a book full of errors and myths, and so we've earned our time of tribulation again in this country, and I think we're going to start seeing certain aspects within the way we conduct our affairs and business, where the freedom of religion that we've had in this nation since its founding is going to be very challenged and tested. Technically, what some of these governors are doing and mayors are doing regarding churches is unconstitutional, but they keep doing it anyway. How can you say protesting is good, but church is bad? How can you get away with that?
It's crazy. And, everything that you just said, I agree with. Unfortunately, the decline of the strength of Christianity has come about because a lot of the mainline churches have just basically become like the rest of secular culture. It's secular culture with a temple.
Exactly.
And people don't want to go to church to engage in secular culture. They want something else. And I think that that's led to what I've just seen the other day. The Gospel Coalition in the US put out a story only dated the 9th of August, actually, and the headline screams, "Survey. Majority of American Christians don't believe the gospel." And
I know.
They go on about the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University that conducted a pretty broad survey where they asked a lot of different questions to people who identified as Christian, to find that most of the beliefs that people had were anything but Christian. There's almost half of them believed in universalism. Most of them, 54% believe, only 54% believe they would experience heaven after they die.
Let me give you something that I think really sums up where we are today in the church. I'm not sure who said it. I wish that I had so I could take credit for it. I can't. But a retired bishop a while back made this statement. If we as the church no longer evangelize, then the church will be evangelized by the culture that it lives within. And that is what we've seen happen in too many church bodies. They have been coerced and they have been co-opted to be part of the problem. They're part of the world. They're not a part of anything that has anything to do with the actual body of Christ on this earth.
Yeah, very, very sad. So tell us about your church, the Reformed Anglican Church. How is this different, Bishop Bob?
All right. Well, we're probably both familiar with some of the continuing churches that are around the United States, and it's an alphabet soup. I'll just tell you right up front. I remember a bishop friend of mine, this has got to be over 23, 24 years ago, as I started out. In my 40s is when I entered the ministry. And he told me something that I thought rather fascinating. When we talked about the church, he said, the continuing church will be the church in the wilderness. It's going to have 40 years of having to, purge itself after the breakaway from the Episcopal Church at that time. And that has occurred a few years ago. Most of the founders of the church that I knew back then are all dead and gone now. And gradually these continuing churches are beginning to stop the internal bickering. Now, for people like me and where I'm at, I've been through all of the various divides and anger and getting upset with each other and forming new groups. I've been through it all over the past 20 years. And a bunch of us decided one day we had all come through various ringers, so to speak, and the troubles that we had. And we are in a small group. We're not exactly high church. We're not exactly low church. But we are very traditional. We are very oriented toward the prayer book. The closest thing, I guess, I'm not sure what is used in Australia these days, but I know the English version from England, the 1661, would be the closest liturgy that I'm used to using. You've got one. Yeah, I've got mine. My 1661 small one.
Yeah.
So
I've got also yours here, by the way. I'm a bit of a nut. Here's the 1928 American.
Yep, I've got some new copies of that too here as well. So we are traditional, but we're a small group, but we're also very evangelical. And I think that's the best way I can describe, who we are to other people. And so, we got together. We have a handful of churches that are actually doing very well. One has a parochial school with over 100 students in it. So I think they've done extremely well. And another one up in Massachusetts, Florida, Virginia, let's see, mission starting, I think, in Tennessee, and a couple of other churches from other smaller jurisdictions that are saying, why don't we come together because we are so similar? And you're seeing an alignment within what I call the traditional Anglican churches that are not a part of Canterbury, the ones that are not a part of the quote official communion. Because, unfortunately, the official communion is the Church of England, the Church of Canada, and the Episcopal Church in the United States, which are all a bunch of heretics now. I'm sorry, but they are. They preach things, and they accept things, and they do things that are non-biblical.
Yeah.
And so I can't be associated with them. Even our big group here in the United States, a breakaway group that is made up of a lot of churches, is the Anglican Church in North America, the ACNA. They've got issues, and I don't think they're going to keep it all glued together for much longer. They have, part of them are now social justice warriors, just like the Episcopal Church was before Gene Robinson. Some are for women's ordination, and they do. In other words, there are like 30 different churches looking for a diocese. Or there are 30 dioceses in seek of a cohesive church, and it's not happening. And so I'm already beginning to see some chinks in that armor. For the last 7 or 8 years, they've been the big shiny thing because of their starting and walking away from the Episcopal Church. They're basically the Episcopal Church the day before they consecrated Gene Robinson, and there's a lot of baggage there that goes back to the 79 prayer book that they can't seem to escape.
Yeah. There might be some of my listeners a bit bewildered by this discussion, but we're talking about the trials and tribulations of the Anglican Church, as it's known in America, the Episcopal Church, and the breakaway churches, which are called continuing churches, such as the one that Bishop Bob leads. Now, I'm going to wrap this up with a bit of a plug for your podcast. Currently got Your Weekend Show with Bob Beer, and you can find that on yourweekendshow.com. But tell us about your new venture that's soon to happen. I'm a believer in shortwave radio, and I think that as we come into these tribulation times, it's going to be very important. In the United States, we have several privately owned shortwave radio stations. We're not dependent upon the internet to get our signal to you. We can cross international borders. And so I'm going to be putting together a program, an hour a day, Monday through Friday, that's going to air several times on a number of frequencies. And the target appears it'll be pretty much all of North America, Canada. And on the at a certain broadcast time, it should go right across the Great Circle into the UK and a good chunk of Western Europe. So that's what we're hoping for. Plus, it'll be online, but I also recognize, as you do, that the online can always be censored in many places. It can be shut down in an instant. If the tech tyrants don't like you, they can cut you off, or they can get your rankings so low you can't be found. And so I'm trying to build a radio show that even when you can't find it on the internet, you can find it on the air, because it's amazing. The tyrants of the day think that the internet is the only thing out there. Schools were amazed that there are students that couldn't get online because where they live, they have lousy internet. They're so far out in the country. And so this concept that the world is connected by the internet is true to a point. But there are a lot of people that are not, and a lot of people that are like me that recognize that, international radio is a very powerful tool. Sadly, I think in your country, your ABC shut down a lot of your shortwave stations a while back, and a lot of people out in your rural areas were very unhappy with that. Am I correct? We still have some radio stations there on the ABC. They've reduced a lot of the resourcing, though, of country radio stations. Most of it's just simply syndicated stuff from cities.
Well, I think that shortwave is one of those things that, especially during times of emergencies, is a very valuable resource that shouldn't be ignored. And I'm looking at ways of even adding more, because I'm also an engineer. So when I'm in Florida, I do some work for a shortwave facility with 14 transmitters and 23 antenna systems. So it's quite an operation that can... I'm not sure if we have any antennas. I know we've had QSL reports out of Australia on some of our frequencies. So I know we reach there. I don't think my show's going to be on one of those frequencies, but yet, give it time.
Well, you can hear it on the internet and on podcast, as you said, truth2ponder.com.
Right, and it's actually truth2ponder.com. Somebody else had already gotten Truth2TO, not a bad website, a very Christian website. So what I've got is truth2ponder.com. That's truth2ponder.com. I just got the website put together, and there's still a few finishing touches. And I've got people like you and others that I want to get involved, because I see this kind of ministry growing when it becomes increasingly difficult for the church to get its word out, that we can use something like the internet, not just the internet, shortwave radio, along with the internet, to reach places we can't reach. I know one Christian station that I'm on, which is another shortwave facility over in Africa. It can reach into the Middle East. And quite often some of your the Middle East, certain countries will shut down the gospel coming in. They will. Pakistan is one that can do that whenever they can minimize you. China, of course. And so we can reach North Korea and China with radio where they can't be reached with the internet. That's how I look at it.
Well, more power to you, and I encourage people to go and listen to your podcast and radio show. Bishop Bob Bierman, thank you very much for joining us for this edition of the Conservative One podcast. God bless you and all you do. And here's hoping for a Trump victory in November.
Same here, and bless you, my brother. We have come to the end of another Your Weekend Show. Don't forget the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. And join us next week at this same time.
Your Weekend Show with Bob Bierman.